Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Welcome very much to today's Food for Thought webinar. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Professor Josh Cohen for today's episode about ambition. As always, let me very briefly do some housekeeping. It would be great if you want to chat to each other. Please use the chat function. If you want to ask a question, however, that you would like me to ask Josh, so I will be monitoring the Q&A function. Please put that in the Q&A function rather than the chat function. And then I will make sure that I will ask your questions to Josh a little bit later in the session. So as always, let me tell you a little bit what is coming up after this week. So next week, we have a session with a sustainable tech business, which is a blockchain-based business. So we're going to be talking about that. The week after that, we're having a debate about books and writing books and management books. And the week after that, we are talking to one of our former students, so an alumnus from our BSc in Business Management degree, who has started a really successful influencer marketing platform. And he's going to talk a little bit about his business journey and all of that. But without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest today, which is Professor Josh Cohen. We're really pleased to have you here, Josh. I think you got an email from us a little bit out of the blue, but we were just like, oh, he's really interesting. He writes really interesting books. We would love to talk to him, and very kindly you agreed to join us. So Josh is a professor of modern literary theory at Goldsmiths here in London. But he's also a psychoanalyst in private praxis. And actually, you told me that you spend most of your time almost working as a psychoanalyst nowadays. In addition to that, you're also a very prolific author. So you've written a number of books, many of which sound very interesting. And one I've actually read is Not Working, which is maybe something we'll talk about as well today.
Yeah.
And of course, if you are one of our students in the audience, do not read that book.
You are forbidden.
You are forbidden from reading the Not Working book. And you have a new book coming out, and what we're talking about today is part of that. And the new book is called How to Live and What to Do in Search of Ourselves in Life and Literature, which I think will be out next February. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
So we're getting a sneak preview of that. So again, welcome, Josh. Thank you very much for being with us today.
It's lovely to be here.
So let me ask you first how it is that a professor of modern literary theory is also a psychoanalyst.
Yeah, no, fair question. Actually, in a way, the paths are not quite as divergent as you'd imagine, because one of the weird things about psychoanalysis is that, in other countries like America or Argentina, psychoanalysis really lives alongside medicine, alongside psychiatry, alongside sciences. For various reasons that are too complicated to go into, really, psychoanalysis kind of migrated more into the humanities and the social sciences in this country. And so when you study literature at university, almost any course you do, you'll have at least one lecture on psychoanalysis. And so one of those lectures, when I was a stripling of 18 years old, was about Freud and about psychoanalysis. And I was kind of fascinated by it. And I think I incubated this interest. Kind of, kept reading psychoanalysis, but didn't think that much more of it. Decided I wanted an academic career, did my PhD, got my first post at Goldsmiths, my only post, as it turned out, the only people who would have me. And I stayed there, building, ambitiously an academic career, and publishing papers and books and doing what one is supposed to do. And I sort of had what I might call an early midlife crisis in my early 30s. It wasn't that I didn't like academia, it's just that I find it difficult to sort of, I found that I penned myself in too early, that my ambition in a way had been a bit constraining. And that now I saw myself sort of staring down the barrel of a gun of 40 years of just marking undergrad essays and going to conferences where they serve bad coffee. And so I started to think about other things that had interested me. I had a brief conversation with my wife, who's an artist, and artists just have this attitude of, well, just do whatever you like, do. So I said to her, you know, I was reading some Freud. I said, it would be cool to be an analyst. And she said, well, you should do it then. And I said, don't be ridiculous. I'm on this other career path. I'm not just suddenly going to start becoming an analyst. How many years does that take? Anyway, I went to see an analyst. I made inquiries. And within some months, I was on this kind of roller coaster path. Not really a roller coaster because it takes years and years and years. But I was on this very intense journey towards becoming an analyst. And while I was training, my department were accommodating in the sense that as long as I remained a decent enough colleague and carried on doing stuff, they were okay with my training. They thought it was kind of interesting as a development. And I've tried as much as possible, when it's possible, to bring the two disciplines together. And this book, I guess, that is coming out is a good example, I think, of that, of really trying to bring together my love of literature and my fascination for the human mind and its depths.
I actually was going to talk to you about that because I think in general that's what you like to do in your books, right? You combine literature with your own experience, I guess, and then with your experience as a psychoanalyst. And you tell a lot of stories of your patients, actually, which I assume are entirely anonymized. And
radically anonymized. It's one of those, you know, difficult things, but I really try to get to the point where no one could definitively say themselves. I recognize hang on, that's me. They might recognize the odd snatch of a phrase, but you know, it's now put in the mouth of somebody of a different gender or, you know, completely different age, sort of, or something, you know, professional.
So we're here to talk about ambition. That was the topic for today, which is something you write about in your new book. But we thought it would be a great topic for this week in particular, because it's week 1 of term 1, as you know. So we have, at the business school, we have thousands of new students who are either undergraduate or postgraduate students who are starting to study in an extremely difficult environment, obviously, because of the pandemic, because they are not in London, most of them, they're really displaced. It's a really difficult time to study. And in the chapter that I read of your new book, you actually start out with a conversation with your son, which really touched me when I read that. And maybe you could very briefly talk about that, because I think it might resonate with what a lot of our students are thinking at the moment as well, and how also that is related to ambition.
Yes, and the poignancy of this, by the way, is that you know, he's one of the students we're talking about. He's just starting his 2nd year at Sussex University, and also feeling, I think, quite displaced and disconnected from the epicenter of student life. But this was a conversation I had with him during his gap year, and we started having this discussion about possible futures, career paths, and I really wanted to sort of, you know, take up the role of parental sage because I'm narcissistic enough to do that. And I realized a very short way into the conversation that he wasn't quite having that all this talk of a future was really screening out some basic essential part of reality. And the part of reality he wanted to talk about was whether there was going to be a future at all, whether how much longer life as we know it on this planet would be sustainable. You know, he's not a kind of militant XR. You know, he's very interested in those movements. He goes to the protests, but I would say he represents, you know, not somebody at the epicenter of protest, but somebody at its fringes who's just thinking about it and whose messages kind of get into his consciousness and scramble his head a bit. So he sort of said to me, you know, how is it that your generation always manage to somehow circumvent this question about whether there is a future. You talk as though it's going to happen, and when we sort of say, well, what about the planet? You say, well, it's all a bit abstract. And he was trying to say to me, to him, it feels nothing could feel less abstract than the possibility that the basic building blocks of life that we take for granted could be endangered for him and the generations after him. And that, of course, puts a very different spin on the whole topic of ambition.
Of ambition, right? Because I think one of the things that you talk about as well is that ambition kind of requires the assumption that there's a future, right? A future can be ambitious about. So if you are questioning the validity of that, whether there is going to be a future, it's very difficult to kind of develop an ambition. So what is ambition actually? So maybe we could briefly talk about that to make sure that we know what we're talking about. What is ambition? At what level does it operate? How is it different from aspiration, for example? So where are we drawing the lines?
Yeah, it's a really useful question because it is quite an ambiguous word. When we say I am ambitious, we're not really saying what I am ambitious for. It's come to be associated, I think, over the sort of the course of modern history with individual ambition. So ambition is ambition for myself. It's for my expansion into the world, my aggrandizement, my increasingly high profile recognition. It's associated with the desire for praise, for riches, for different kinds of worldly recognition. And one of the philosophers that I talk about in the book is Hannah Arendt, the great mid-century, originally German, but eventually American philosopher, wrote in English. And in a book of hers about the American Revolution, she talks about a distinction made by the second president of the United States, John Adams, who made a distinction between emulation, which is aspiration, which is ambition, but it's ambition which is there to serve a greater good, which is there to serve something bigger than you. And what he called ambition, which is a kind of self-aggrandizement in the name of an increase in one's own power and influence. So it never goes beyond oneself. So I think ambition forks in that way for all of us. We want to do something for ourselves. We want recognition. There's no point, as far as I'm concerned, in being pious about that and saying you should entirely divert all your interests for yourself into the world and not care about yourself and simply work at making the world a better place. Because so much of our mental energy is actually inevitably channeled into ourselves, and that energy can be harnessed to make the world better. It doesn't need to be renounced. It doesn't need to become something that you're ashamed of. I don't think people should be ashamed of their own ambition. I think that it's important with people who are on the cusp of an adult career to think about the pull between the world and themselves, the pull between wanting to do something for the world beyond themselves and wanting to do something for themselves. And I think ambition is always about the tension between those two.
I was actually going to ask you that next, which is whether those two things, emulation, thinking about the greater good, and trying to advance your own ambition, necessarily have to be an opposite, or whether they can live in conjunction with each other. So our students, different from yours, are business students, right? Yeah. So they're going to business school. They're investing a lot of money in their education. Many times they have to take on a lot of debt in order to pay for the education. And then obviously they will have to make sure that they get a good job that earns enough money in order to pay that back. So is it reasonable for us to expect them to think beyond their own ambition towards this emulation. But then again, given that they are in business schools, maybe it's particularly important for them to think about that, because they will be eventually the people in business making a lot of decisions that could be harmful or not to the world. So how do you see that particular group of people?
One of the things that I think Arendt is really useful in talking about is the way that certain spheres of life get kind of lumbered with a very constricted definition, a very constricted sense of what they are. And I think one of those words is business. So, you know, Arendt would say that there's a certain conception of business which is purely about the increase of productivity and profit. And that this has been cut off from a kind of broader conception of business, of commerce, as an enlargement of public good. You know, corporations are always, you know, to some degree or other, very much aware of that. They're always trying to find ways, whether it's through the arts or through charities, through various kinds of civil society partnerships. They're trying to reconcile themselves to that aspect of their place in the world. And sometimes that can come across as cynical window dressing, and sometimes that can come across as something very real. And maybe our task in an age where we're increasingly seeing the cost of blind productivity and profitability is to make that sort of that interest in the world beyond profit something real. And this has a history, you know, that there's a kind of a really interesting parallel history with engineers. You know, if you look at the history of the engineering profession, now it's sort of associated with something very functional, very much sort of based in a kind of neutral practicality. The engineer just gets tasked with whatever project it is, you know, the civil engineers say, with whatever project it is they've been asked to conceive. But in the 19th century, the engineer really saw themselves as a cultural figure, as much as a sort of practical, functional figure. Somebody who was trying to remake the world with a vision of public good, of what people actually needed to live, to make good cities, to make good spaces for exchange and movement and meeting. And that's something, I think, again, with the multiple threats that we see facing, you know, a prosperous way of life. It's one of the ways that there's a potential for a revival of that conception of the engineer. I think there's potential for a revival of our conception of business as something that isn't sort of narrowly defined. So that as soon as you say, well, what about civil society? What about the wider good? You say, well, that's somebody else's problem. I just do business. You know, in a way, we have an opportunity for a much more kind of integrated conception of what business would be.
So the idea, so actually we're already getting a question, so I'm going to come to that in a second. So indeed, the idea would be that, you know, it's almost not an excuse to just think about yourself. On the opposite, if you are in business, you probably have a really large responsibility to think about the greater good and see how everything fits together. And I assume, especially throughout the pandemic, we've seen how many businesses had to kind of reconceptualize what they're doing in order to respond to this situation, right? I do want to ask about the potential dark sides of ambition. And we kind of said that, and you obviously, you write about Gatsby, you write about other literary characters as well in your chapter, but it would be interesting to kind of maybe talk a little bit about when ambition actually becomes destructive and negative, and also how that does relate to Gatsby. So maybe you want to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Gatsby, Great Gatsby, I you know, one of the reasons why I thought we could talk about it at least briefly is because I imagine it as being a book that almost anybody in the audience has come across at some point. Many of us, certainly if we come from the US, will have read it at school, but actually people read it at school or at A-level, certainly as undergraduates over here. And it's just a book that circulates very widely among us. It's part of our sort of common cultural fabric. And, Gatsby, of course, is about a young man from the Midwest, dirt poor, who realizes an ambition when the yacht of a wealthy miner comes ashore near his home. He gets aboard the yacht and he becomes an apprentice to Dan Cody, a tycoon, and he learns the ways of business. And then he falls in love with a young girl when he's conscripted into the army. And when he goes to war, the girl falls in love. Well, doesn't fall in love, sorry. She marries somebody else, somebody old money, and they live in an old money mansion. And Gatsby buys the mansion opposite this couple to be near the girl that he loved most in the world, and to try and sort of recover for himself that love, that fantasy of the future that he'd had when he first met her. And so he chases the girl, and this is the very, very famous last two paragraphs of the book. And I'll just read them because they're very short, and they're so beautiful, and they'll be familiar to many of us. So this is Nick Carraway, the narrator, who's contemplating the dock opposite the Buchanans, the dock from which Gatsby gazed at the Buchanans' mansion, dreaming of Daisy. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So what is sinister and beautiful about that paragraph? It's that Gatsby is looking for somebody when he looks at this green light on the end of the dock. He thinks what he's looking for is this young woman called Daisy. But actually, he's looking for something much more elusive than that. And there's this moment in the book where we realize that actually he knows who Daisy is. He knows that Daisy is a shallow, self-interested, and rather cowardly woman who would prefer to be with this brute of a man who sort of keeps her within the circuit of what she knows, than take the risk of running away with Gatsby. She's never going to leave Tom Buchanan. He knows that that's who she is and that's what she's like, and that she's really just an entitled, privileged, spoiled individual. But he can't stop believing that she's in what she represents, which is something else, something bigger, something beautiful, perfect. And what he's saying is that the dream, he chases a dream without realizing that it's already behind him, that the dream is already dead. And that's when ambition becomes, I think, something more sinister, more self-defeating, even self-destructive. When we chase something whose purpose, whose object we think we know, but actually the purpose has already eluded us, and we're plowing on blindly without really knowing what it is we're doing. I think many people who get into sort of the midlife of a career can find themselves in this place, can find that, you know, they did everything right. They sort of, you know, crashed through all the ceilings. They got their promotions. They made all the right moves through the course of their career, and then they find themselves at a certain point saying, "But is this what I really wanted? What was the purpose in all of this frenetic activity and all this chasing?" And they can find Gatsby that the dream they thought was ahead of them is actually behind them.
I think this relates really nicely to a question that one of my colleagues actually asked in the chat. And he basically says that as a business school lecturer, he would like his students to be more collectively ambitious rather than individually ambitious. And it relates back to a little bit the conversations we had earlier about this tension potentially between the individual and the collective, because we very often pay more attention to individual ambition. But as you say, it does indeed happen. I suppose I am in that age range, you know, in the 40s, where a lot of my friends are coming to that point where they're kind of waking up and they say, I've worked so hard, I've achieved everything, but I'm not certain that my life really has the meaning that I would like it to have. And in a way, maybe the collective ambition is a way around that. So how do we develop a more complete sense of ambition in our students, for example?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that one has to think of it in terms of a kind of educative task rather than just giving examples, because you could give examples, for example, in sustainable and green business, which is great. But this is also about how we think in a kind of broader, more philosophical sense about the purpose of life, the purpose of work. I think that, you know, in some European countries, France, for example, philosophy is incorporated into the educational program in a much more integrated way. And when I talk about philosophy, in a way, I'm talking more about a high school version of philosophy than a formal academic version of philosophy. In other words, not necessarily studying Kant's categorical imperative or Hegel's theory of history, more asking directly philosophical questions about the purpose of life, about what it means to have a career or to want the best for oneself. I mean, we bandy phrases like this around very casually, but we rarely think about what it means. So I think it would be important maybe for business or any kind of vocational schools, you know, medical schools as well, law schools as well. All of these different practices, after all, touch very directly and rawly on questions of public good. You know, what is medicine for? What does the law serve? And I think that particularly maybe in this country, we have a very functional view of vocational disciplines. We think that they're only there, I mean, just to steal the words of my book title, they're there to tell us what to do, but they're not there to help us think about how to live. And actually integrating those questions is really important. So I would have thought it begins at the beginning, probably at high school level, but certainly carrying those questions into the big vocational schools and saying, what is it that we want out of building businesses, out of growing individual careers? You know, is an individual career a matter of amassing more wealth and power, or does it have something to do with what Adams called emulation? And the thing about emulation, of course, is that it involves somebody before you who sets an example, who you would want to model yourself on. And I think what that brings is a kind of humility. It brings a relationship to somebody else that says, I wasn't here first. There are other people who can sort of legislate for me rather than I just legislate for myself. And that sense of there being others that I have to take into consideration, that are going to be affected by whatever whatever I decide to do with my life, other people are going to be affected. You know, in that sense, I'm not merely answerable for myself.
I think that's a really interesting point, because it again refers to Hannah Arendt, who I think also said that we need to stop prioritizing knowledge over thinking. So I think it goes to that point of
Yes.
that we focus so much on functionality and functional knowledge rather than on what it actually means and how we get there, right? So we are almost out of time. We are actually out of time, but I do want to finish with one question that Marcus has been asking in the Q&A. And he basically said, it comes back to the conversation you had with your son, that we kind of need to assume that there will be a planet out there so that we can have a future, right? So Marcus quite poignantly asks, so how does ambition work in the setup when in the long run we know the sun might blow up at some stage? How can we actually have ambition in the face of that knowledge? So how did you resolve it with your son, and what positive note can you hopefully leave us with for today?
I think in a way you resolve it by not trying to resolve it too much. I think it's right that you do assume that there will be a planet and future for you. But when I say assume, I don't mean take it for granted. You assume it in the sense that all of us have to probably get much more serious about taking responsibility for that assumption and asking what it is we need to do to ensure that there actually is a future, to integrate that more and more into our daily sense of what we're doing with our lives and what kind of world we want to make together.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Josh. I'm going
to
leave us all on that note because we're already a couple of minutes over. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar and see you again next week. And Josh, thank you so much for being with us. This was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.